There.
We're just waiting for a couple more people who may be here but haven't gotten in yet.
Yeah.
That's the reason.
And we're live now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We're live, so.
Okay.
You say somebody was on the elevator? Okay. Would Sam? Yeah, did he let you know that?
He just walked out and somebody's.
Okay.
Maybe down to.
I hear it. Yeah, I hear it.
There's about 4 people downstairs that are waiting for the elevators.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Grace, you want to give Rabbi Goldstein a? Yeah. And the other people who are about to come from downstairs.
Was the door open? Did Sam open the door?
He was
for her?
down, yeah, and then I brought a chair over because there was somebody who couldn't sit, or couldn't stand, I mean, so they're giving a chair.
Stand? Where?
To get, so that they don't have to walk through the elevator. They can't go down the elevator. They're working on it. That's what he said.
Okay, here's somebody.
That was the first person who came up, which is what got the chairs.
Yes. Pardon? Big Bang.
Were there more? Were there more people out there?
When I came in, there were like 4 people sitting where the outside coming in, and then there was 1 person coming.
Where are
Well,
they?
let's go ahead and start. We could be here all night.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
we should start. Hello, everybody. As I think you all know, I'm Peter Wenz, and as you probably realize and have known, that I am not a physicist, an astrophysicist, a cosmologist, or a theologian. Yet, I am going to speak on all of those themes because that's what I do. One of the things to recognize, talking about creation, is that we are an evolved species. So there's no guarantee that we're going to ever understand all of it, whether we think of it as theological or scientific. What I'm going to say tonight is that both that the theological and the scientific share some conclusions, but leave about as many mysteries as one another leaves. So that it's going to still be, if I've been successful, you will leave here as confused as when you arrived. Our evolution really is determined by what philosopher Patricia Churchland called the 4 F's: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction. This is G-rated. Well, we talk about there being a creation. In the ancient world, though, people did not believe that there was a creation. The Greeks, for example, thought that the world had always existed. The universe as they knew it had always existed. And there's a reason for that. They reasoned that every event has a cause, and the cause comes before that event. And the event wouldn't happen except for that cause. So that cause also had to have a cause before it. And that had to have a cause before that. And so there could be no beginning, because the beginning would be causeless. There would not be a cause for a first cause, because it was first. So there was no first, because it couldn't happen, because it couldn't be caused, because it was first. So they thought, with real reasoning, that the universe must have always existed. This view, by the way, certainly persisted, or at least came back again, in the 20th century with the physicist Fred Hoyle, who had a steady state view of the universe. And he thought that the notion that there was a beginning of the universe was so absurd that he coined the term, which he meant to be mocking the view that there's a beginning. He called it the Big Bang. And then it turned out to be the term that we now use, as if it's a thing that happened. One of the reasons why we think that it happened is that the universe is expanding, and so it doesn't seem like it could have been there forever, expanding. But we'll get to that in a minute. The first challenge of physics that both common sense and science at a different level than just physics, as well as religion, would oppose that many physicists believe that there is such a thing as time, but time does not pass. It doesn't happen. It just is. The idea here was taken up by some people in the theological community that, well, if there is a God, not Jewish theology, if there's a God, or at least I don't know about it in Jewish theology, if there's a God, God knows everything. Well, if God knows everything, everything includes the future. So in a sense, the future isn't really future, at least not from God's perspective. And God's perspective is reality. So a lot of, especially Reformation thinkers like Calvin were big into this, and that's why you have predestination, because what's going to happen is going to happen because God knows what it's going to be, and then there are some difficulties related to free will involved in that, but we won't get into that. It's just that there are physicists who, not for theological reasons, but for reasons of physics, believe that time doesn't pass. And instead of it being in God's mind, it's in the mind of the physicists such as Newton. Now, Newton couldn't figure everything out, even about the solar system. He got great contributions. But Pierre-Simon Laplace, in the early 19th century, a mathematician, figured out what Newton couldn't, and claimed that he could, if he knew the state of the universe at any given time, then he could predict what was going to happen, everything that could happen in the future, the indefinite future, or the infinite future, whatever it might be, long future. Equally, if knowing all of the laws of physics, you could, from knowing how everything was going at any one time, also figure out what happened to bring the universe to that state that it was in. So immutable laws of nature, rather than the eternal knowledge of God, kind of substitutes it. They work the same way. If the laws of nature are immutable, then in a sense, everything that has happened and will happen is kind of present now, because it is inevitable given the laws of nature. It's just that we don't know what all those laws are. That's the only reason for uncertainty about the future. Take this then to think about a computer. A computer, if you put this knowledge of all these laws of nature into the computer, and the current state of the universe into the computer, then the computer could do what Laplace was saying could be done. And that algorithm, in a sense, would have within it all of the information that the theologians had attributed to God. It would contain all that information about the past and the future, because the past and the future would simply be logical, mathematical consequences of the computer program. I mean, that would all be concentrated within the computer program. Turn on the computer, it could figure out what happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future. In a sense, in that program, it's all present. One way of looking at this, there's a physicist, current physicist, Brian Greene, who analogizes this view that time doesn't pass to a movie reel. Imagine you show the movie and it happens in time, but all of those frames exist simultaneously. You see them separately, one at a time, or a flow of them, but in fact they exist all at the same time, just not for you when you go to the movies. Right? Well, he's claiming time is like that. It's all there now. It's all simultaneous now, but we don't experience it that way. Einstein said, when a friend had died, one of his very good friends, and he wrote to the wife of this good friend to try to console her, he appealed to this notion that time isn't real. In the first place, Einstein's special theory of relativity makes time relative. If two things are at high speed relative to one another, the one that you're on, time's going faster than the one that you're not on. Time slows up when it goes fast compared to you. So, for example, if you're on a spaceship and there's another spaceship and they're going, very fast in relation to one another, if it's Wednesday for you, it may just be Tuesday for them, from your perspective. From their perspective, it's Wednesday for them and Tuesday for you. That's an implication of, in fact, the main thesis of Einstein's special theory of relativity. Well, that again suggests that, time isn't what we think it is. Common sense time isn't real. And following the other physicists, he also believed that everything was really simultaneous. And this is why he consoled this widow by writing to her in a note, for we convinced physicists the distinction between past, present, and future is only an illusion, however persistent, but it's an illusion. Well, obviously this goes against common sense, but Brian Greene points out the only reason why the film looks like time is passing in it, even though it's really all there, is that it passes one frame at a time in front of a light that illuminates it successively. In physics, he says, there is no element, there is no process, there is no concept that would correspond to that light illuminating one frame at a time. Therefore, in reality, which of course as a physicist he thinks physics tells us about, in reality there is no passage of time because physics can't explain it. Well, the problem is that just because physics can't explain something doesn't mean it's not real. Physics does not cover all of reality. Somehow, not all physicists recognize that, but some do. I analogize it this way. You know, how could the physicist make this mistake? Because these are brilliant people, you know. And I analogize it to a map. A map is a model, as is the physicist's notion of the universe. It's a model of the universe. The whole universe, it's in a book, you know. There's a lot else in the universe besides his book. Then, in maps, you can have different features accented and brought out, make you aware of. For example, you have a road map. Well, that tells you how to get from here to there on the roads, and it might indicate when there's a one-way street and that there's no access to the interstate from this road. But that road map might not help you determine whether you need a passport. You need a political map for that, right? It might not tell you in case you're hiking and you have problems with breathing, whether the path is going to take you high and where there's, you know, the air is thinner. You need a topographical map for that. A topographical map is also helpful if you are a pilot so that you don't run into the mountain. So, and if you're a developer, then you probably want a map about zoning laws. You know, this is zoned for that. See, all of these maps give you the truth about the area, but they don't give you the same truth because they're concentrating as models on different aspects of reality. And that's the answer to the physicist, that you're concentrating on one aspect of reality, but there are other aspects that the physicists ignore. I was amazed when I started to research this stuff several years ago to find that somebody, Lee Smolin, had come out with a book that said that basically that time is real and something has now in the title. And the reviewer said excitedly, why, he might be right. He might be right that time is real. What, you know, who are these people? So my kind of error theory is that they have erroneously assumed that everything that they study in physics is everything that there is in reality. So that, I think, is the error. It's also the case that these physicists who deny that time is real write memoirs. That's a little strange, right? And they tell you about their research. You know, they made this grant, and then they needed more money, and so they applied again. What do you mean again? It seems kind of. And another thing is that they didn't seem to consider they're after laws of cause and effect. Generally speaking, there's a time between a cause and its effect. So, my thinking, not being a physicist, is that they have a limited view and that they say that time doesn't really pass. In fact, according to the physicists, time isn't just time, it's space-time. That's from Einstein. That is, so if you were looking at this film that Green was talking about, each frame would be, well, it would be three-dimensional, and then the fourth dimension would have a time stamp on it. if time didn't flow the way we think it flows, then you could easily have a film of a glass. We'd normally think, okay, now you see the glass is just in the first frame, it's just a little bit below the hand, and there's a tile floor because you're in the kitchen, and then the next frame it's a little closer to the floor, and then it's closer to the floor, and then it hits the floor, and then a lot of glass on the floor, right? Well, if time didn't really pass, why would that have to be the order? Why wouldn't it go down one, and then the next frame is the same place when they were building the kitchen, and the next frame is some dinosaur running through the woods at that place tens of millions of years ago? The fact that we expect it to just kind of continue the way we indicates that time passes. So we've got time, and again, this now agrees with most theology in the Abrahamic traditions. We think that time passes. The Bible contains stories of things happening. Well, how does this get us to a beginning? Well, it means that whatever began contained time. What else? Well, another thing about time is that in our experience it is unidirectional. It goes in one direction. Past, present, future. It doesn't just kind of wobble here and there. There's a direction to it. Well, if there is a direction to time, then there has to be a beginning of time. And that is because if there was no beginning, then time in the past would be infinite. So this brings us to the concept of infinity. The whole numbers are infinite. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so on and so on without stop, right? That's the concept of infinity. And so on and so on and so on without stop. That's what infinity means. The fractions are also infinite. 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, etc. You can go on, so on without stop. In other words, there is no such thing as an infinite number. Infinity is the denial of a stopping place. It's saying, no, it can keep going. If there is a stopping place, then it's not infinite. For a mathematician like David Hilbert came up with the notion to illustrate this of a hotel that had infinite rooms. Now, what if the hotel is full and a new guest arrives? Can you accommodate the new guest? Well, yeah. You just move the guest in room number 1 to 2, and 2 to 3, and 3 to 4, and you've got room for the new guest. Or if 10 new guests, you move 1 to 11, and 2 to 12, etc. Because since there's no stopping at the end of the number of rooms, because it's infinite, no problem. In fact, there's no problem even if an infinite number of guests shows up. So long as it's the same level of infinity, which I'm not going to get into because I don't really understand it very well. So, and it's irrelevant anyway. Let's suppose you've got this hotel, infinite, and another infinity shows up. Well, what you do is you put the new guests in the odd number rooms and the old guests in the even number rooms, or vice versa. Since there is an infinity of odd numbers and an infinity of even numbers, you're covered. So infinity plus infinity equals infinity. Well, if that's what infinity is, then, and time is unidirectional, how could there not be a beginning of time? This was something that the philosopher Immanuel Kant discusses in one of his antinomies. Immanuel Kant believed that the world as we see it isn't really the real world. Our minds are processing reality in a way that accommodates our way of thinking, but it's not real reality. And one way of trying to show that it's not real reality is to show that what we think of as reality, like here and now, is contradictory. And one of the contradictions that he found was concerned the beginning of time. So he argued both that there has to be a beginning of time and that there can't be a beginning of time, to show that, see, time isn't real. I agree with one of them and I disagree with the other. I agree that there has to be a beginning of time if it's unidirectional. If it's unidirectional, we got to this point, right? If there's no beginning of time, how much time was there beforehand? It came from, what, infinity? And this is the completion of that prior infinity? Makes no sense. You can't complete an infinity. If it's not an infinity, then there was a beginning, right? So that's his argument, there has to have been a beginning. His argument that there can't be a beginning is that goes back to the ancient Greeks. Every event has a cause, and so that had to have a cause before, and that had to have a cause before, etc., etc. And so he thinks nothing can happen without a cause. So how do you argue against that? You have to say something happened without a cause. Now that's bold, and especially now about time. Well, wait a minute, it happened without a cause, then what happened before that happened without a cause, which began time? Before there was time, what was going on? Answer is nothing. Nothing was going on. The idea here is to distinguish an everlasting time, which is what Kant was thinking about. Go back and going back and go back, and time has existed forever, everlasting, and to eternity. Eternity is the absence of time. So there was, before time, there was no time. This is where it comes in about the feeding and fleeing and stuff, and our brains may be not able to accommodate itself to all of reality. So there was no time, it was just eternity. This suggests, by the way, theologically, that God could begin time simply by thinking, because that would be an event, even before creation. That could be time as we know it. Or you could have a Big Bang. So the theological thinking in the Abrahamic traditions and the physics of this, the logic of it, using the notion of infinity, actually agree. There has to be a beginning. And that beginning has to be uncaused. So when people say, well, what caused God? That's like asking, I'm forgetting the name of the physicist, what's north of the North Pole? Wrong question. There isn't any north of the North Pole. Similarly, there isn't anything before time began to have begun it, to have caused it to begin. Some things have to be, well, either spontaneous or, well, the beginning of God's thinking would be spontaneous. Nobody nudged him, start thinking. And so time can begin. Well, if, and there's another reason to think that time had to begin, the notion of entropy. Entropy is the tendency of everything to disperse and become unorganized. There are two kinds of empathy. One is statistical entropy. That is, if things are in their proper place, Grace will know this about where I work, they soon will not be in their proper place. But But rather than use my working space as an example, imagine that you have a manuscript, like a novel or something like that, but it's just a manuscript so the pages can blow, and a big wind comes and the pages are in order, but then it flies all over the room, and you pick them up, you don't try to put them in any particular order. Well, they're going to be in a different order, most likely, than the right order. See, there's a right order and there's a wrong order. This was the problem with Humpty Dumpty. After he fell from the wall, there was as much matter there as there had been before, okay, in a splat, condition, but that was a lack of order. See, the molecules were forming a shell before, and they stopped. And of course, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. I've often wondered what the horses were supposed to do. My fear is that this is a sly allusion to the role of horses in the production of glue. I don't know, but I'm hoping not. Anyway, so that's why in our universe we have entropy of the statistical sort, in that things mess up and you can't put the scrambled egg back together, except in a film. Now that we've got time ready, you can use films again. So then you've seen the eggs that are scrambled go back to have these, with yolks and stuff like that. Well, the other kind of entropy is thermodynamic entropy, and this is the dispersion of energy. If you have a cup of coffee and it's hot, you're in the room, even if it's a closed room, the coffee's going to get colder and the room slightly warmer because heat is the jiggling of molecules, and those molecules are going to jiggle other molecules of the cup and the cup of the air, etc., and they will get some of that heat, that jiggle, which is heat. And the result will be ultimately a uniform temperature, that is, the coffee will be at room temperature. And it doesn't have to be coffee, it could be hot chocolate. So, and then, and that's in a closed system. Now, if it's an open system, then you can have energy, where you have energy input, then it can be counter entropy. For example, you can have the sun heat come up, heats the ground faster than it heats the water. The hot air rises, creates a lack of pressure, air pressure there, so the air over the water goes towards, some of it goes towards the land, and you've got wind off the ocean or off the sea. That's because you've got an input from the sun. In fact, all of life on Earth, almost all of it, comes from that input from the sun. So you get greater organization, living things like us, from lesser organized things, only because you've got this outside input. When you have no outside input, then nothing, no work can get done. There isn't a concentration of energy that can then affect other things. Once in the isolated situation, all of that energy becomes equal. The energy, the air pressure, and everything becomes equal. The perpetual motion machines are like this. The idea of a perpetual motion machine is it's got this energy in it, and can it go on forever? Well, no, and the reason is that just because of friction and stuff like that, it will jiggle some molecules outside of itself, thereby losing some of its energy, and eventually it won't have enough of a concentration of energy within it, because it's lost it, to keep going, so it'll stop. When energy levels are equal, then nothing can change anything else. You need concentrations of energy to do that. Well, the universe is a closed system in the sense that there's only one of them. Or if there's any other universe, it's not affecting ours. So, the energy in the universe, which is from matter as well as energy, E equals mc squared, but will run out if the universe has been going forever. Because the molecules will have jiggled other molecules. If there had been an infinity of time, then anything that would happen would have already happened. And what would happen, it being a closed system, is that there would be no concentrations of energy. But there are concentrations of energy. So it couldn't have been from infinity that we got to the current position. So that's another reason, besides the mathematical, to think that there was a beginning. Well, and again, the beginning is creation or it's the Big Bang. There are some people who think that, well, maybe the universe is like an accordion. It's expanding right now, but gravity pulls matter together, so maybe it will eventually get to, it'll go, and then it'll come back together again and contract, and then we'll have a big bang again, so like the big bounce, and it's going to go back. And current thinking, however, is that that's not what's going to happen, because the flying away from one another of all matter is accelerating, there's no reason to think that it's going to go in the opposite direction. I mean, you can imagine it doing so, but there's no scientific evidence that it is. All the scientific evidence is on the other side. It's not going to come back together again. So we're back to just the Big Bang from the scientific perspective. Well, if something is going to begin without cause, do we have any analog of that in science? Well, yes, we do. The quantum theory, you know that certain materials are radioactive and they lose radiation. And then we talk about their half-life. When does this material lose half of its radiation? We don't talk about what atom lost its bit of radiation. And we don't, because according to the standard model in quantum physics, there is no cause at the individual level. It's only statistically that the thing degenerates or changes. The there are two models here. One is the individual atom does what it does, whether it does or it doesn't emit its bit of radiation, without any cause at all. It's totally random. Or it is random from our perspective, and so from the scientific perspective it can't be predicted. That would be like tossing a coin. We assume the coin toss is governed by physical laws and is in that sense determined, but it's so complex that we could never predict whether it's going to be heads or tails. Statistically we can predict it. 1,000 tosses come out about even heads and tails. But in no individual case can we predict it, so it's random from our perspective. That's why we can use it at the beginning of football games, which is, the main reason for physics. So that means that you could have a non-causal beginning of something on the model of quantum physics. Here's the problem with the physics approach. We have two models that both work in their realms. And so we have very good reason to think that Einstein's general theory, as well as his special theory of relativity, is accurate. Except that when it comes to, and it predicts kind of a Big Bang, except it goes a little too far. According to its equations, at the beginning, there is infinite energy in infinitesimal space, both of which, and there's also infinite curvature of space, which is logically absurd. It's a non-starter. That can't be. Somehow it's gone off the rails when it came to the beginning. Quantum theory says, no, you can't have infinitesimal space, you can't have infinitesimal anything. There's small quanta. It's like the pennies are to our currency, the smallest unit. There are smallest units. And so the beginning could be one of these, from the smallest unit, spontaneous. But we still don't have any reason why the universe began about 13.8 billion years ago rather than 20 billion years ago, or 200 billion years ago, or 10 billion years ago. If something begins without cause, there's nothing else to appeal to explain why it began when it began. And in fact, when it began, there wasn't a when because there wasn't any time, from a physics point of view. So, physics, and I'm going to wrap this up. Physics, when I was young and skeptical, as I continue to be, I thought, well, okay, temple's fine and all that. You know, I had a bar mitzvah, I went to camp, I loved the camp songs, and was confirmed and stuff in the Reformed tradition. But I thought, if I really want to know about stuff, I've really got to, science is going to explain this at the time. So it was Fred Hoyle and by the way, Gamow, who I read 1, 2, 3 Infinity, and didn't understand much of it, but I figured this is that gives us the truth. Well, what I've come to believe is that the science actually, when it comes to the ultimate questions about the beginnings of the universe, really doesn't do a lot better than the theological beliefs. Einstein's theory is true, and quantum mechanics is true, and they are logically incompatible with one another. That is, they both can't be true, but they are in our scientific universe, the universe of science at the moment. This is worse than God and evil. You say, well, if there's God's good and can do anything, and why is there evil in the world? Well, that's not really a contradiction. God could have his reasons, something like that. It's not a real contradiction. It's kind of a tension, but not a contradiction. Einstein and quantum theory, it's a contradiction. So in a way, it's even worse than theology. But the two agree that there's a beginning. The two agree that the beginning has to not be caused, because in theology, God would be the beginning, not what God does. And time is real. So they agree that much. And as far as our really understanding it, not so much. Because at the beginning, the Big Bang, by the way, you might think, well, it's a Big Bang that happened someplace. No. The Big Bang created the someplace. There was no there. It's worse than Oakland, California, according to Gertrude Stein, that there just wasn't. It's the Bang is the creation of space from energy. Right? And, well, most physicists will tell you, anybody who claims to really understand quantum mechanics is self-deceived. It's not understandable, but it works. That's how a lot of things that we have, a lot of technologies we have, are based on that. And the satellites that we have, they go fast enough compared to the land that they're 200 miles above, that we have to use Einstein's equations to keep the times together, because it's going slower up there than it is here. Except from up there, it's going slower here because of the speeds. So they both work, but they're incompatible. So for skeptics like me, should be skeptics even more skeptical than we have been before. That's it. Yes?
You made a statement, I might be misquoting you, I didn't understand much of what you talked about. That in the Abrahamic religious no earlier or later in the Torah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which I don't know that parallels one of these systems you're talking about.
Maybe.
I mean, when I was a student, it was just a very convenient and dubious a way of borrowing things from later in Scripture that was clearly from the later time to corroborate or prove something that was clearly from earlier time. But saying there is no earlier or later, no beginning, no end.
Oh, that's interesting. I was aware from the Calvinist tradition, got really into that. But no, I was totally unaware.
Can we go back to your thing about the hotel and the...
Oh, yeah? No, it's not a good investment. It's just a
Well, no, I
concept.
don't know whether the problem with the analogy or with my problem in understanding the concept, but, I mean, I don't understand why to accommodate this endless or infinite flow of new guests, you have to move people around into odd numbers, or even numbers, or starting with 10. I mean, because the bottom line is there's not an infinite number of beds, bed linens, rooms, heating, air conditioning to accommodate an endless supply.
Right.
And
This,
you might just keep adding on floors to the hotel, more rooms. You can't do that as quickly as you have guests.
well, that's right. This is a purely mathematical concept. He wasn't, I don't think Hilbert was a physicist. He was just a mathematician. And so there are physical constraints. And that's what the entropy thing about how there has to be a beginning of time brings in the physical constraints about things. But Hilbert was just talking about the mental idea of infinity. And it should, by the way, it's kind of interesting that see, who was it? I think it was Lee Smolin, one of the physicists, was quoting an even more eminent physicist that, well, after an infinite amount of time, such and such will happen. What are you talking about after an infinite amount of time? There is no after. And that's what the point here is. Or to borrow from a different religious tradition, Amazing Grace, the last verse is, when we have spent 10,000 years bright shining as the sun, we won't have fewer days to sing God's praise than when we had first begun. In other words, you can take 10,000 years away from infinite time, and you still got infinite time. You haven't taken anything away from it. That's the idea, which of course has nothing to do with physical constraints because it's, God. And so too with Hilbert's Hotel. It's just a thought thing. So you can't put the next infinity after the first infinity. You have to intersperse it because there is no after the first infinity, because it's infinity. Yes?
If you accept the idea of the Big Bang, before the Big Bang, there was nothing. And so nothing came from something.
Well, something came from nothing. Yeah. Yes, and again, that notion of creation ex nihilo, which has theological significance. Again, I'm not so sure it does in Judaism, but certainly it does, in some people's interpretations of creation. And so this would actually go along with that creation ex nihilo idea in certain theological views.
If there was nothing before the Big Bang and it came, boom, it's there. Everything, life, plant life, trees, humans. Eventually, we're along the course of what happened after the Big Bang. The Earth is made of atoms and molecules. We're made of atoms and molecules. We're actually, the only reason we can see through the body is because of the motion of the atoms inside of us that
Right.
defines it. But if you don't believe in God, a higher power, how did that happen? No physicist has ever said, oh yeah, well, something from nothing because here, look at this formula.
No.
So there's only one way that could have happened.
Well,
I mean,
the way it happened would be by spontaneously, or after God spontaneously started thinking, and then God started.
by itself, it's not.
So this basically contradicts our common sense and most science in most fields, that to get something to happen, something else has to happen before it.
Right.
That caused it to happen. And this is saying, well, yeah, for everything except for the beginning. Oh, and in quantum physics events at the very small level
So
of
then you get
electron.
into the argument of, it winds up arguing things like Darwin, which I don't happen to believe in. I think there's too much scientific evidence nowadays, and most of it is suppressed. But if you want to read about it, you can read about it, get, all kinds of information. And that again shows me, we didn't come from a little tiny amoeba, and over the eons we became what we are, and then everything else in the whole universe became what it is, only because of that original Big Bang Theory, which, if it didn't come from a superior person, our minds can't wrap around something from nothing. I can't, you can't.
No, you're right, yeah.
So I think it all leads to taking another look at creation itself, and the scientists that want to look at creation without the intervention of some higher power, they're never going to get an answer. The creation of a higher power is an answer, unless you ask the question, where did the higher power?
That's the thesis of the book. By the way, this comes from a manuscript, which isn't a book yet. Hopefully someday it will be, called An Atheist's Guide to Belief in God. And this is chapter 3. The issues that you're raising are chapter 4. They really are. So you're right. I think you've correctly said, okay, well, wait a minute. The implication of this is, hey, how do people get developed out of this? Yeah, there's a view that the physical constants of the universe are geared to produce folks like us, to life and such. So, yes.
I'm not sure that the biblical version necessarily points to a Big Bang theory or creation of theory. What it actually, it's often mistranslated from Hebrew as in the beginning, which is not what the Hebrew actually says. The Hebrew says, at the time of creation, God created, separates light from darkness, the world, whatever the universe is tohu, or tohu. And it's, again, this is a poor analogy, but it's like there was not a cake on my kitchen counter 2 hours ago, but the ingredients for making the cake were there in the refrigerator.
Yeah.
So at the time of the creation, Mike took flour and eggs and milk and put those ingredients together, and then with energy, heat, whatever, along comes the cake. I mean, if it's in Oxford, it indicates that there was stuff beforehand.
Yeah,
and that the real reason for even including it is not to depict how the world was created, but to show that there was order in creation, that there's hierarchy in the universe, that there are rules in nature that are meant to be followed, and where do we fit into all of that? I mean, that's always how I've understood the beginning chapter of Genesis. It's not a scientific text. To
Right.
explain where we fit into all this and what rules we need to follow.
Yeah, and that has always been well, not with that sophistication, but I've always thought, well, wait a minute, if you look at the Bible, there isn't a creation out of nothing. That's a theological view that I didn't know it was ever part of Judaism, but it certainly is part of some groups of the Abrahamic religious traditions. But it's something that is significant for our thinking, because then you would ask, okay, so there was God and there was this dispersed cake ingredients, where they come from. And I think as Jews, we're not as interested in that as some others in the Abrahamic traditions are. And so we to my knowledge, we haven't developed that part of thinking as much as, some other folks have it, who came up with creation ex nihilo. That's.
Now, how do you understand the meaning of this word time? Because again, in my mind, time is really just a form of measurement. The way that inches and yards measures distance and decibels measures volume.
Aristotle said
that hours and minutes, tell us how long to keep the cake in the oven and how long it will be before the Jews finally start to arrive. It'll be at least 20 minutes late. Time is just a measure.
Well, Aristotle said that time is the measure of movement. So for Aristotle, there isn't any time without movement. That's why if you think of the Big Bang thing, which fits into the creation ex nihilo idea, then there wasn't any time because there wasn't anything that moved, because there wasn't anything to move. You've got to have stuff moving. No stuff, no movement, no time. Pardon?
But there wasn't stuff. Although if you read the actual Big Bang theory, there was a primordial something. That I think in terms of 11, Y-L-E-M, which is the primordial pre-Big Bang.
Well, I don't think that's the current view. The current view is that energy exploded. And the reason why you have these particle accelerators smashing atoms into one another is to see that when they do that, some energy is created or is produced through the reduction of matter, E equals mc squared. And then what happens with that energy? How does that energy, when does that energy become matter? Matter in the universe turns out to be, in our scientific view, pretty important because that's what we're made of. So it'd be interesting to know if it started with just energy, how did matter get there? And that's chapter 4. I'm not going to tell you. What that really means is I didn't read chapter 4 before coming over tonight, so I might mess it up. Yeah, but I got to read it too. I read it 2 years ago.
There's one, this linear development that's in the Bible. There's one great exception to that, and that's the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, where it talks about an eternal cycle, and there's nothing new under the sun, and what's the point of doing anything because everything repeats. And so that is interesting that book was brought in that has an entirely different, I wondered if that somehow was influenced from Indian philosophy, but they put it in the Bible, and so the people who compiled the Bible were willing to put in that sort of counter viewpoint, which is interesting.
Well, yeah, one way you could look at it is to analogize it on the scientific thing to the cyclical universe view. That is what I mentioned before. There's a big bang, and then gravity pulls things back, and so it really turns out to be a big bounce because it goes out in and out. And that would be a cyclical view also. But if we retain our notion of time as linear, then one cycle repeats another cycle, and then there's another cycle and another cycle. There's a linearity among the cycles, even if there isn't within each cycle.
Ecclesiastes is considered one of the most Hellenistic books to make it into the final canon. Is there a Greek thinker who mirrors and reflects that same kind of thinking? Who spoke about this issue?
The Greeks certainly had a cyclical view of things because of the seasons, but the philosophers that I'm thinking about were not. I don't think they were cyclical thinkers. I can't think of one of the philosophers who was really taking
Although-
That's one of the reasons why the philosophers weren't liked that much, because they were saying things that were against the religion, and the religion had a lot of cyclical stuff, and the philosophers, I don't think, picked that up.
And I mean, in Greek tragedy, there's a certain element of inevitability.
Yes.
I don't know if that speaks to time and those kind of issues. There's no escaping that Odysseus is gonna, marry his mother and poke out his eyes when he kills his father.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's more in the, I mean, there was the mora is the Greek for fate. And so Oedipus would be in that category. And the philosophers were not into it. And so it's not surprising to call it, isn't Ecclesiastes part of the wisdom literature? There's a wisdom, you have some wisdom about how things work, and that things, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Sounds better in French, but I don't remember what. And so that's kind of a more other piece of literature than the philosophy literature. I see that we're at 5 after 8, so even though we started a little late, we can end a little less late. What's that? How late? How late did we start?
5 after 7.
So, thanks a lot.
Turn back.